Lera had always been skeptical of mysticism. She believed only in what could be explained by logic and science. But one phone call turned her view of reality upside down. Late at night, when Lera was sitting at home alone, working on her laptop, her phone suddenly rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but something about it struck her as odd. The numbers looked unnatural, like they were blurred, barely readable. At first she decided not to answer, but the call came again a minute later. Curiosity got the best of her, and Lera pressed the answer button. "Hello?" she said, trying to hide her slight irritation. There was silence on the other end of the wire, but soon there was a low whisper, "Lera. Why did you forget me?" The girl's heart froze. The voice sounded familiar, but she couldn't remember who it belonged to. "Who is it?" Lera asked warily. "It's me. You promised not to forget me." The voice grew louder, but remained barely audible, as if speaking from far away. She wanted to drop the call, but her finger froze over the screen. Suddenly memories of the past began to surface in her mind. School, old friends, and one of them, Dima, who had died a few years ago in a car accident. "Dima? Is this a joke?" Lera said in a trembling voice. A light chuckle was heard in the phone, which sent shivers down her spine. "You remember. So you haven't forgotten." Lera felt something cold touch her shoulder. She looked around, but there was no one behind her. The call was interrupted. The phone showed a strange notification, 113, last call completed. But the most frightening thing was that the call didn't appear in the call log. With trembling hands, Lera placed the phone on the table. She tried to convince herself that it was just a strange joke or a technical failure. But a couple minutes later, the phone screen lit up again and a message appeared. "I'll be there. You promised." Lera sat motionless, staring at the screen of her phone. The message disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, as if it had never been there. She quickly opened the messaging app, but there was nothing in her chat history. Trying not to panic, Lera decided to call back the strange number. She dialed it with trembling fingers, but the phone only gave a short beep and then said, "This number does not exist." "It's just a glitch," she whispered to herself, though the voice in her head screamed otherwise. All the next day, Lera tried to forget about the incident. She went to work, met with her friends, but the feeling of uneasiness didn't leave her. Especially when she saw that the clock on her phone froze twice during the day at 1:13, the time when the strange call occurred. By nightfall, Lera felt exhausted. She went to bed, leaving her phone on the table. She fell asleep almost instantly. But at 1:13 a.m., she was awakened by a strange noise. It was a quiet ringing, like a vibration on the phone. Half asleep, she reached for the device, but to her horror, she saw that the phone was off. The ringing wasn't coming from it. It was coming from the living room. Lera slowly got out of bed. The noise was becoming more distinct, sounding like the ringing of an old corded telephone. But there was no such phone in her apartment. Barely had she reached the living room door when the ringing stopped. The room was silent, but the air seemed as cold as a winter's day. And then Lera saw it. There was a picture lying on the floor. It was of a school group, with Lera surrounded by her classmates. But what immediately caught her eye was Dima, who had died, looking directly at her. His face was highlighted, as if it was brighter than the rest. On the back of the photo in red ink was written, "You promised to remember." With shaking hands, Lera picked up the photo when suddenly she felt someone standing behind her. She turned around sharply, but saw no one. And then the phone rang. This time the ringing came from her smartphone. The screen showed the same number again. Terrified, she threw the phone on the couch, but the ringing didn't stop. Gaining courage, Lera picked up the phone. "Dima, is that you?" she whispered. The same familiar voice came through the phone. "You've forgotten me." but I'll remind you. I'll be with you soon." The connection was cut off, and the light in the apartment went out. For a moment in the darkness, Lera noticed a shadow. A tall, human-like figure stood at the window. She screamed, but the shadow disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. At that moment, the light returned. Lera rushed to the door and barricaded it with a chair, trying not to panic. But she knew, this was only the beginning. Lera had been up all night. After the bell rang and the shadow appeared, she couldn't stay in silence. The television was on, though she didn't even watch it. Every sound seemed suspicious to her, every rustle made her heart sink. The next morning she decided to tell her friend Anya about the strange events. Lera hoped that the conversation would help her dispel her fears, but after hearing the story, Anya looked alarmed. "You say you heard Dima's voice?" Her friend questioned incredulously. "Yes, and I do not understand how it is possible." "He's dead, Anya. He's dead, Anya." Anya was silent, lowering her eyes. Then, after a little hesitation, she said, "Maybe it sounds silly, but you can't be sure about such things. When Dima died, you remember what we said, don't you?" Lera frowned. Memories surfaced as if from a fog. Back then, after the tragedy, she had actually promised something. A promise from the past. It was at the cemetery, after Dima's funeral. Lera, Anya, and a few of their friends were standing by the grave. In a moment of despair, Lera, feeling guilty for not being able to say goodbye to her friend before the accident, said, "I will never forget you. I promise." She herself had long forgotten that promise, but it didn't seem to Dima. "Do you think it's because of those words?" Lera asked weakly. "Who knows? But sometimes they can come back if they feel they've been forgotten," replied Anya quietly. "Maybe he just wants you to fulfill your promise." When she returned home, Lera found that the strangeness continued. There was an old notebook on the table, though she remembered exactly that she had put it away in a drawer a few years ago. It was the book in which she and Dima had written notes to each other back in high school. Flipping through the pages, she found a message she hadn't seen before. It was written in the same red ink as the inscription on the photo. "You promised. I'm waiting." Lera's hand trembled. Suddenly the phone rang again. This time the number looked normal, a landline, from her hometown. She answered, but she heard the familiar voice in the receiver again. "Do you remember?" he asked. "The meeting. Tomorrow. At the old bridge." "What bridge? What are you talking about?" Lera screamed. But the answer was crystal clear, "Where I stayed." Lera realized that Dima was talking about the bridge where the accident happened. This place she had not visited since the day of the tragedy. Too much pain and fear was associated with that place. But now she realized, no matter what was happening, it wouldn't end until she went there. The next day, close to dusk, Lera gathered her courage and drove to the bridge. Her heart was beating so hard she thought she could hear it pounding. The bridge was abandoned and the crash site was surrounded by silence. She moved closer when the phone rang again. "I'm here," a voice whispered.
Lera stood on the abandoned bridge where the tragedy had occurred a few years ago. There was an oppressive silence all around, only the wind occasionally running along the metal railing. The phone in her hand trembled along with her fingers. "I'm here," repeated the voice in the receiver. Lera looked around, but saw no one. However, something in the air had changed. The space around became dense, as if the world had frozen. "What do you want?" Lera asked nervously. "Why do you keep calling me?" A sigh was heard in the receiver, and then a voice answered. "I'm waiting for you. You should have come earlier. You promised to remember. What do you want?" Lera asked nervously. "Why do you keep calling me?" A sigh was heard in the receiver, and then a voice answered. "I'm waiting for you. You should have come earlier. You promised to remember." "I remember you, Dima," she whispered. I never forgot. At that moment, the air became icy. Lera felt someone standing behind her. She turned around sharply and saw a figure in the distance. It was a man, but his features were blurred, like an old photograph. The figure took a step closer, and Lera saw his face. It was Dima. Only his eyes seemed empty, as if life had gone out of them. "You're finally here," he said. His voice sounded the same as it had when he was in high school, but now there was sadness in it. "I've been here all this time alone. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you find peace?" Lera asked, feeling the tears running down her cheeks. "Because you wouldn't let me go," he answered. "You promised to remember, but then you tried to forget. I was trapped here between worlds, waiting." Lera realized that she was the reason why Dima's soul remained attached to this place. She realized that all these calls and visions were his last attempt to reach her. "What am I supposed to do? How can I help you?" she asked. Dima looked at her with his empty eyes and said quietly, "Just tell me that you forgive yourself. And me. Then I'll be able to leave." The words stuck in Lera's throat. She had long blamed herself for not saying goodbye to him, for not talking to him before that fateful night. But now she realized that it was pointless to cling to the past. "Forgive me, Dima," she whispered. "And I forgive you." Dima's figure began to dissolve, becoming more and more transparent. Before he disappeared completely, he smiled at her. It was the same warm smile she remembered from her school years. All around, the wind was blowing again. The world came into motion. Lera looked at her phone. A message popped up on the screen. "Thank you. Goodbye." It was the last thing that reminded her of those events. The phone never rang again, and the strange phenomena stopped. Lera returned home, feeling the heaviness that lay on her heart finally disappear. She knew that now Dima had found peace. But sometimes, in rare moments of silence, she wondered, was he really gone forever?